A majority of the American people want to end this war rather than to have it drag on interminably. The action I have taken tonight will serve that purpose. A majority of the American people want to keep the casualties of our brave men in Vietnam at an absolute minimum.
After Dr. King's murder in 1968, America stood at a crossroads. Hundreds of cities erupted in rebellion. The poor were organizing across racial lines. America's imperialist wars were quickly losing public support. College campuses were filled with chants, sit-ins, and the smell of marijuana and burning draft cards. And for a brief moment, it felt like the revolution might actually happen. Solidarity was building, but so was the counter-revolution. The ruling class responded with force. FBI programs like COINTELPRO infiltrated activist groups, sowed paranoia, and got people killed. Anti-war leaders were surveilled, socialists smeared, the working class divided by fear. Into this fire walked a man promising to restore order. His name was Richard Nixon, and he would go on to launch the war on drugs, not to stop addiction or reduce crime, but to criminalize dissent. His Southern strategy flipped the South from segregationist Democrats to reactionary Republicans, not to fight racism, but to rebrand it into something more palatable. And then, on May 4th, 1970, Ohio National Guardsmen fired into a crowd of unarmed Kent State students, killing 4 and wounding 9 more. They were protesting their government's invasion of Cambodia, which expanded the Vietnam War into yet another country, despite Nixon's campaign promise of achieving peace with honor and de-escalating the war. In the chaos of protest and repression, Nixon laid the foundations for the corporate coup of democracy that would follow. In the wake of the Civil Rights Movement, the Democratic Party had fractured. They had passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965 under President Lyndon B. Johnson. Black Americans were finally finding their voice in the United States government, and white conservatives were furious about it. The South had been solidly Democratic since the Civil War, but Nixon saw an opportunity, not to win over black voters, but to capitalize on white backlash. In a 1970 interview for the New York Times, Kevin Phillips, Nixon's political strategist, explained the Republican Party's new strategy. From now on, the Republicans are never going to get more than 10 to 20% of the Negro vote, and they don't need any more than that. The more Negroes who register as Democrats in the South, the sooner the Negrophobe whites will quit the Democrats and become Republicans. That's where the votes are. The Southern strategy, a way to lure Southern whites to the Republican Party by appealing to their racism without explicitly saying so. No more burning crosses, no more Klan hoods, unless you were really into that sort of thing. Republicans created new code words, dog whistles, ways to say the loud part quietly. In a now infamous 1981 interview, Lee Atwater, a political consultant and Republican Party strategist who would go on to become an advisor to President Ronald Reagan, said, "You start out in 1954 by saying, by 1968 you can't say, that hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. You're getting so abstract now that you're talking about cutting taxes, and all these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and a byproduct of them is that blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously, maybe that is part of it. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that if it is getting that abstract and that coded, that we are doing away with the racial problem one way or the other. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying, we want to cut this, is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than..." The busing thing Lee Atwater was talking about referred to the court-ordered policy used in the 1970s to enforce racial integration of public schools, especially in cities where schools remained de facto segregated after Brown versus the Board of Education. While publicly rejecting racism, Nixon appealed to the white suburban voter who feared integration, resented urban unrest, and felt alienated by progressive change. Law and order became the rallying cry. But what it really meant was crack down on black and poor communities, criminalize protest, maintain control through fear. This wasn't just politics anymore. This was a secret declaration of class war disguised as a cultural war. In Chicago, Fred Hampton, at just 20 years old, was doing something dangerous. He was uniting the poor across racial lines. In 1969, he founded the Rainbow Coalition. Black Panthers, Young Lords, and poor white Appalachian organizers, united by shared poverty. "We're going to fight racism not with racism," he said, "but with solidarity. We're going to fight capitalism with socialism." Hampton helped feed over 3,000 kids per week through free breakfast programs. He built clinics. He offered political education. The FBI called him the Black Messiah. Their internal COINTELPRO files named him, explicitly, as a threat. In 1969, an FBI informant named William O'Neill provided a detailed map of Hampton's apartment. On December 4th of that year, Chicago police raided his home. 99 shots were fired. Hampton was killed in his bed. He was 21 years old. Hampton's fiancée, Akua Njeri, said, "They stood in the doorway and said, 'He's barely alive.' Then I heard 2 shots. Then they said, 'He's good and dead now.'" Hampton was assassinated by the state less than a year into Nixon's presidency for daring to imagine a multiracial working-class movement. But the state doesn't always need 99 bullets to kill a revolutionary. Sometimes it just rewrites the law. It begins to speak in code and dog whistles. 2 years after Hampton's execution, Nixon gave us one of the greatest dog whistles of all. In 1971, President Nixon stood before the nation and declared,
"America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive."
And just like that, the war on drugs was born. But this wasn't about public health. It wasn't even about drugs. But it was, indeed, a war. A race war. A class war. A war against solidarity, against organizing, against revolution. In a 1994 interview that went unpublished until 2016, John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy advisor, said, "We know we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities." Nixon dramatically increased federal drug control funding, doubling the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs budget, while simultaneously cutting treatment and social services. Police were given new tools, new funding, and new targets. Possession became a felony. Bail became unaffordable. Prisons filled to the brim with the poor, the radical, the non-white. All while drug use remained widespread in white, affluent communities like Wall Street, Hollywood, and Ivy League colleges. In a 1969 diary entry, H.R. Haldeman, Nixon's chief of staff, wrote, "Nixon emphasized that the whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to." Under Nixon, marijuana arrests skyrocketed. Even though Nixon's own 1972 Schaefer Commission recommended decriminalizing it, Nixon rejected that recommendation, and by 1973, the DEA was formed, consolidating drug enforcement power. Nixon's war on black Americans wasn't waged with drug arrests only. In 1969, a group of 21 Black Panther Party members were arrested in New York City and charged with conspiring to bomb department stores, police stations, and the Bronx Botanical Gardens. It was a high-profile terrorism case. Afeni Shakur was one of the Panther 21. At just 23 years old, she stood trial while pregnant with Tupac Shakur, facing 300 years in prison for crimes she did not commit. She won, but she spent over a year in jail awaiting trial. Eventually, all 21 were acquitted. Justice wasn't the point. The point was to oppress and disrupt the organizing activities of black leftist intellectuals. That system would become the American carceral state. By the end of the decade, the prison population had surged, but Nixon only laid the groundwork for the horrors that came after him. Under Presidents Reagan and Clinton, the prison population tripled. In 1970, the people of Chile elected a Marxist president, Salvador Allende. He promised to nationalize his country's vast copper mines and redistribute the wealth to combat poverty. That made him a threat. President Nixon and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger saw Allende not only as a rival, but as a warning. If socialism could succeed at the ballot box, it might spread. So Nixon gave the CIA a direct order: make the economy scream. What followed was economic sabotage, covert funding of opposition media, strikes engineered by business leaders, all of it backed by the CIA. On September 11, 1973, the Chilean military, led by General Augusto Pinochet, overthrew Allende in a violent coup. Allende was killed. Democracy in Chile died with him. The stadiums filled with prisoners, thousands were tortured, thousands more were murdered or disappeared. And in the aftermath, the economists arrived. They were called the Chicago Boys. Chilean students trained under Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago. Their blueprint for the economy of Chile was called El Ladrillo, the brick. Their solution to Chile's problems: privatize pensions, healthcare, and education, eliminate price controls, crush unions, deregulate markets. It was called neoliberalism. By 1982, 9 years later, unemployment in Chile soared over 20%, real wages dropped by more than 40%, and poverty exploded across the country. From Iran to Guatemala to Chile, the message was clear: defy capitalism and the American empire will destroy you. While Nixon was cracking down on dissent around the world and on the streets of America, he was also reshaping the economy. For nearly 30 years after World War II, the U.S. had lived under a system forged by Franklin Roosevelt, the New Deal order. High taxes on the rich, strong unions, public investment, currency backed by gold, capital controls to protect workers and domestic industry. Nixon didn't destroy that system overnight. He just pulled the foundation out from underneath it. The US dollar had been pegged to gold for decades, $35 an ounce. This system, known as Bretton Woods, kept international finance stable and predictable. But in August of 1971, with the Vietnam War draining US reserves and inflation rising, Nixon announced that the US would suspend the convertibility of dollars into gold.
We must protect the position of the American dollar as a pillar of monetary stability around the world.
That moment, known as the Nixon shock, effectively ended the gold standard and untethered global capitalism from real-world constraints. Now, the dollar floated, capital flowed freely, and the rich began to weaponize speculation and debt. With inflation rising and unions demanding higher wages to keep up, Nixon enacted a radical move. On August 15th of 1971, he announced a 90-day freeze on all wages and prices, the first peacetime controls in U.S. history. It was widely popular. A Gallup poll showed 75% of Americans supported it. Even some labor leaders initially applauded it, thinking it would rein in corporate price hikes and protect wages. But the truth was more insidious. AFL-CIO President George Meany, in a 1971 interview, said, "This program puts too heavy a burden on the working man and the poor. It is far too generous to big business." Nixon's wage freeze only came after inflation had already eroded real worker income, and it was paired with no controls on corporate profits after Phase 1 ended. Phase 2 saw the establishment of a government pay board for wages and a price commission for business prices. By 1973, corporations were raising prices again, but unions were still under wage restraint, and contracts were frequently rejected for being excessive. By late 1973, Nixon's economic controls were already showing cracks, but it was a foreign shock that would blow the whole thing wide open. In October, during the Yom Kippur War, the United States sent massive military aid to Israel. In retaliation, members of OPEC, led by Saudi Arabia, imposed an oil embargo against the U.S. and several allies. Overnight, oil prices quadrupled. Americans faced shortages, rationing, and panic. Speed limits were lowered. Gas stations closed on Sundays. In some cities, people waited hours for a few gallons of fuel. Inflation skyrocketed, and so did unemployment. The term stagflation entered the American vocabulary, meaning a period where both inflation and unemployment are high, and economic growth is stagnant. This combination was once thought nearly impossible. Policymakers were caught off guard. Traditional tools couldn't fix both problems at once. The working class was squeezed from both sides. Wages were still capped under Nixon's lingering controls while corporations passed the cost of oil hikes straight to consumers. Stagflation shattered Keynesian consensus economics, leading to the rise of Milton Friedman's neoliberalism and monetarist thinking. After the embargo was lifted in March of 1974, the damage was done. The rich recovered. The poor were told to tighten their belts. More than an energy crisis, the 1973 oil embargo was a class crisis and a warning. Global capitalism, unmoored and unaccountable, could now plunge the working class into chaos at any time. By decoupling wages from productivity, undermining the dollar, and making the working class pay for imperial overreach, Nixon had planted the seeds that would flourish under Reagan. The Nixon administration didn't just start the war on drugs. It escalated the war on political dissent. Through COINTELPRO, the FBI waged a secret campaign against leftist organizers, civil rights leaders, and anti-war activists. The Black Panthers, anti-war student groups, the American Indian Movement, the Socialist Workers' Party, anyone who dared speak of revolution became an enemy of the state. Martin Luther King Jr. was dead, Malcolm X was dead, Fred Hampton was dead, Angela Davis imprisoned. The FBI had files on over 500,000 Americans. In 1972, Angela Davis said, "What is dangerous is not the individuals who speak truth to power. What is dangerous is the government that fears the truth." Nixon's administration perfected the politics of paranoia, carrying on the legacy of Senator McCarthy, making dissent seem dangerous, even treasonous. In public, he presented himself as the steady hand, the calm voice who would restore law and order. But behind closed doors, he governed with rage, secrecy, and vindication. But some in the ruling class wanted more than just Nixon's bluster. Some wanted a long game. In August 1971, just weeks before Nixon ended the gold standard, corporate attorney for the tobacco industry, Lewis Powell, wrote a memo to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Its message was clear. The American system is under broad attack. Business must learn the lesson that political power is necessary and must be used aggressively and with determination. Powell warned that universities, media, and culture were turning the people against capitalism. He called for an organized, permanent campaign. He called for think tanks, leading to the Heritage Foundation in 1973 and the Cato Institute in 1977, engines of pro-business propaganda. He called for right-wing media, laying the intellectual foundation for building alternative media ecosystems that would culminate in talk radio, Fox News, and conservative publishing pipelines.
Go, please, Satan! Release us to kill the American people!
He called for corporate-funded academia, leading to the funding of university economics departments and public policy centers with corporate-aligned professors and research agendas. And he called for a new generation of judges to rewrite the law in the favor of capitalists. Nixon would soon appoint Powell to the Supreme Court, where he authored key rulings expanding corporate speech rights, such as his opinion in First National Bank of Boston v. Bellotti in 1978. This would turn out to be a major precursor to the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision in 2010, which freed corporations to spend freely on political campaigns. The counter-revolution had become institutional. Nixon may have been chased from office after the Watergate scandal, but the system he built endured, and the class of wealthy elites he served was just getting started. In prisons and boardrooms, in textbooks and courtrooms, Nixon's counter-revolution against the people became the new normal. The dream of democracy was fading, and a new era of corporate rule was quietly beginning. Jimmy Carter, the Democrat who replaced Nixon, continued deregulating industries, airlines, trucking, finance. He appointed Paul Volcker as Fed chair in 1979, who raised interest rates to nearly 20%, triggering a deep recession. Businesses closed, unemployment soared, and in 1981, Volcker said, "The standard of living of the average American has to decline." Wall Street cheered, while working people suffered. Nixon is remembered for Watergate, for telling the American people,
Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
for taping himself into disgrace, for resigning before he could be impeached. But Watergate, as damning as it was, became a distraction, a narrow scandal that obscured his administration's much deeper crimes against America. The dismantling of the New Deal, the repression of the working class, the creation of a corporate political machine that would live on long after Nixon was gone. He didn't end the revolution by sending tanks down Main Street. He didn't need to. He buried it under lawsuits, surveillance, harsh prison sentences, and televised fear. Faith in public institutions was shaken. Voters were ready for something new, and in 1979, they found their messiah. Photogenic, optimistic, ruthless, but with a lovely smile.
The key to restoring the health of the economy lies in cutting taxes.